It's 6 p.m. on a Friday here in Korea. Welcome to our newscast. I'm Daniel Che. Let's begin with the headlines. The latest UN sanctions on North Korea is said to be at least twofold stronger than any one previously imposed on the Hermit Kingdom, ranging from mandatory inspection of cargo and expansion of weapons ban to blacklisting of North Korean individuals and entities. On THAAD, the U.S. Pacific commander points out that Seoul and Washington are only starting discussions on whether to begin talks on the American missile defense system, and even then there are no guarantees the system will be deployed in Korean soil, a response seemingly evoked after U.S.-China ministerial talks. The side effects of the main opposition's filibustering to stop passage of a counter-terrorism bill, the vote on redistricted constituencies postponed, with the clock ticking down to the general elections on April 13th. The UN Security Council's draft resolution in response to North Korea's recent nuclear tests and missile launch has been released. The unprecedented sanctions could be imposed as early as Friday. Our Kwon So-wa has our top story.
It will represent the strongest sanctions against North Korea in more than 2 decades if passed. That's according to U.S. Ambassador to the UN Samantha Power, presenting the China-backed U.S. proposal of the new resolutions draft at the UN Security Council's meeting in New York Thursday. South Korean ambassador to the UN, Oh Jun, expressed his approval of the new sanctions, which he said are twice the strength of existing ones. The sanctions would include mandatory inspections of cargo going in and out of North Korea, the expansion of a weapons ban, and blacklisting 17 North Korean individuals and 12 entities. New are the so-called sectoral sanctions, a ban or restrictions on specific commodities such as coal, iron, gold, titanium, or rocket fuel.
These sanctions, if adopted, would send an unambiguous and unyielding message to the DPRK regime. The world will not accept your proliferation. There will be consequences for your actions, and we will work relentlessly and collectively to stop your nuclear program.
An official at Seoul's foreign ministry told reporters Friday there has been focus on how to ensure that sanctions are not detrimental to the people of North Korea, stressing that they are, quote, targeted sanctions aimed at the regime's leadership. The resolution could be adopted as early as Friday Eastern Standard Time, should the 15 members convene and vote for a unanimous yes. But it may have to be approved next week, as Russia reportedly needs more time to review the draft. An official at the ministry said the 5 permanent members, including Russia, reviewed the draft prior to Thursday's meeting with the other 10 council members, but that all 15 members will nonetheless be subject to a new vote, indicating the P5 may yet has to get on the same page. Kwon So-wa, Arirang News.
A senior U.S. diplomat arrived in Seoul on Friday to hold talks with South Korean officials on how to deal with North Korea after the UN adopts a new resolution on the regime. U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs Daniel Russel met with South Korean Deputy Foreign Minister Kim Hong-kyun to discuss the allies' joint response to North Korea's nuclear test and missile launch, according to the ministry. They also touched on deploying THAAD missile defense system to better counter North Korean provocations. Russel is scheduled to fly to Beijing on Saturday, where he is expected to hold further consultations regarding Pyongyang with his Chinese counterparts. It seems like Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi's meeting with his U.S. counterpart has exerted influence over Washington's THAAD stance, while making it clear that China still considers denuclearization and peace treaty talks as being the better option. Oh Si-young fills us in on the top Chinese diplomat's moves.
Has Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi's meeting with U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry led to a shift in Washington's decision to deploy its anti-ballistic missiles defense system in South Korea? That seems to be the case, as U.S. Pacific Commander Admiral Harry Harris Jr. said neither Seoul nor Washington have agreed to put a THAAD in South Korea at a Pentagon briefing on Thursday. The military's top commander in the Pacific also made clear that the decision to discuss the deployment of THAAD does not necessarily mean the 2 allies will deploy the system, leaving room for possible changes in the future. In the wake of North Korea's long-range missile launch, Seoul and Washington were set to sign an agreement on holding talks to deploy the THAAD system in South Korea, aimed at deterring Pyongyang's nuclear threats. But this was abruptly postponed on Tuesday ahead of a meeting between Wang and Kerry in Washington, adding to speculation that China's strong opposition to deploying THAAD in the Korean peninsula may have played a role in the setback. The Chinese diplomat has strong words against the deployment.
I must point out that the X-band radar associated with the THAAD system has a radius that goes far beyond the Korean peninsula and reaches into the interior of China. We believe China's legitimate security concerns must be taken into account and a convincing explanation must be provided.
Wang also strongly pushed for holding both denuclearization and peace treaty talks in parallel, a stance that conflicts with Washington. The US had maintained there will be no talks to formally end the Korean War unless North Korea gives up its nuclear weapons program. Whether there will be any changes in THAAD talks or there will be further pressure to hold denuclearization and peace treaty talks will have to be seen after Wang's Washington trip. Oh Soo-young, Arirang News.
It's now time for the last installment of our five-parter on President Park Geun-hye's accomplishments and shortcomings thus far as she enters her fourth year in office. Connie Kim takes a look at how President Park's handling of inter-Korean affairs has changed with the continued provocations from up north.
President Park Geun-hye offered a vision for the reunification of the two Koreas, calling it a bonanza for the peninsula. Later in Dresden, a symbolic city for German reunification, President Park laid out her plan for Korean reunification in three major areas: humanitarianism, integration, and prosperity. And a landmark inter-Korean agreement reached after the conflict seemed to push relations between the two Koreas in a new direction, with a new round of family reunions seeming to offer hope for the future. However, with North Korea's nuclear test and long-range missile launch, President Park has made clear that inter-Korean relations will only improve when Pyongyang gives up its nuclear weapons program. This marks a sizable shift to a more hardline stance against the North. That shift was evident in the president's decision to shut down the inter-Korean Kaesong industrial complex, the most drastic step to contain the North the president has taken so far. And she's warned there are more sanctions to come.
국민 여러분, 이제 기존의 방식과 선의로는 북한 정권의 핵개발 의지를 결코 꺾을 수 없고 북한의 핵 능력만 고도화시켜서 결국 한반도의 파국을 초래하게 될 것이라는 점이 명백해졌습니다.
Most North Korea watchers say Pyongyang's repeated provocations have tested the limits of President Park's trust-building initiative.
There is a limit to what you can do to push for security on the Korean peninsula and build inter-Korean cooperation while North Korea continues its nuclear and missile development. This imbalance has been raised as a fundamental problem with her trust politic.
But just as out of every crisis opportunity arises, experts say this is the time to review policies that could improve relations.
Talks with North Korea after an escalation in tensions will be inevitable for as long as the regime exists. The Park administration should not rule out the possibility of holding dialogue with the reclusive regime when reviewing its North Korea policies.
Whether President Park is able to strike a balance between security and cooperation, between punishment and dialogue in our North Korea policy, is a question that'll be answered when her term comes to an end in 2018. Connie Kim, Arirang News.
Turning to domestic politics, with opposition lawmakers continuing the filibuster to stop the passage of a counter-terrorism bill, the pre-scheduled parliamentary session where lawmakers were supposed to vote on the country's electoral map has been postponed. Shin Se-min highlights the side effects of the Minju Party's valiant efforts.
The filibuster continues, uninterrupted by a plenary session scheduled for Friday, as the two political parties remain at odds over the controversial counterterrorism bill. The pre-scheduled voting session was made obsolete as the National Election Commission missed its deadline set by the Assembly Speaker Chung Eui-hwa to submit the electoral map bill to the Assembly for a floor vote. With a delay, pending state affairs like the electoral constituency and North Korean human rights bills will need to be addressed during the next session scheduled for Monday, 29th. Leading up to the cancellation of the parliamentary session, there were hopes that either the filibuster of the counterterrorism bill or the country's electoral map would be resolved. Under the current law, filibuster cannot coincide with parliamentary session. In order for pending issues like the country's electoral map to be voted on, the filibuster session must come to an end, which would automatically put the disputed counterterrorism bill up for a floor vote. The opposition party believes that the counterterrorism bill will allow the National Intelligence Service to conduct surveillance on civilians if deemed a terror threat. The ruling Saenuri party stressed the bill's importance, citing that Korea is one of 4 countries among the combined 42 OECD and G20 nations that does not have an anti-terrorism law in place, despite the growing terror threats around the world. With more delays in state affairs already behind schedule, concerns are mounting that the failure to resolve the country's electoral map at the plenary session on Monday may even lead to the postponement of the April 13th general elections. Shin Se-min, Arirang News.
Spending by Korea's households dropped to the lowest level on record last year. People are choosing to refrain from making purchases as income growth slows and debt mounts amid feeble recovery momentum. Hwang Jie looks into this trend and the government's countermeasures.
Facing sluggish recovery momentum, Korean households are leaning towards saving money instead of spending it. Statistics Korea says the average propensity to consume stood at 71.9% last year, the lowest level since the related data was first compiled in 2003. The record low figure comes on the back of subdued growth of households' income that rose at the slowest pace last year since 2009 when the country was hit hard by the global financial crisis. The average annual income of households stood at slightly over 4.3 million won, which is roughly $3,500. The slow growth came as earnings of those self-employed dropped after the MERS outbreak put a dent in overall consumption, which had already been suffering from the fizzling economy. And experts say the trend to refrain from spending is not expected to change in the near future, as it's also stemming from longer-term challenges like the aging population and mounting household debt.
The government is pouring efforts into propping up domestic demand through measures like cutting consumption tax. But such measures will have limitations because the current slowdown is a result of structural issues.
So the latest figure once again points to the importance of pushing through the structural reforms that President Park Geun-hye has been emphasizing since last year. But experts say that the 2 years remaining in her term is not enough time to realize such reforms, and that the Park administration should focus more on laying out a solid plan than actual results. Hwang Jie, Arirang News.
One of the world's biggest tech shows, the Mobile World Congress, ended this week. For more on what made the highlights and what was shunned by the unpredictable tech fans during the 4-day event, our Kim Ji-yeon takes us to the venue in Barcelona.
Virtual reality devices, 5G networks, and mobile security solutions took center stage at this year's Mobile World Congress. Security software programs are critical in the era of the Internet of Things, in which every device is connected to the World Wide Web. Korea's Samsung SCS brought its Knox workspace platform for Samsung mobile devices. With the app, private or company data is isolated from other data on the device on a separate environment, often called a container, and encrypted to protect against malware and external attacks. A Samsung product consultant explains a situation in which someone could protect sensitive corporate data even after losing a phone.
First thing I do is I call the IT admin and tell him I've lost my phone. He locks my Knox container, so all of the business data is secure. But after 2 minutes, I turn over a bit of paper on my desk and there it is. I call him back and he unlocks it. If after 2 hours I still haven't found it, so what he'll do is wipe the container.
VR devices definitely got the lion's share of attention at this year's MWC. Samsung's 40-year VR theater, a popular attraction at last month's Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas, was popular again here, with people waiting in line for nearly an hour to try it out. That was the same story for Korea's largest mobile carrier, SK Telecom, with its virtual reality submarine experience. Korea-based LG Electronics also had a small 4C VR experience corner that was packed with people too. That's in stark contrast to last year's MWC, where VR was on the fringes, and smart cars and wearables, including smartwatches and smart bands, were all the rage.
This year's MWC is a reminder of how fickle and unpredictable IT trends are. What was cool this year may not be the next, but one thing's for sure, whoever was here this year will be back in 2017. Kim Jeon, Arirang News, Barcelona.
Well, these are the stories we're following at this hour. More updates coming your way at 10 p.m. Korea time with News Center with Moon Gun-young. For now, thank you for watching.